Elias Rook kept a kingdom of ticking things. Every dawn, while most of the village of Windlebridge was still stirring its porridge, he unlocked the brass-framed door of Rook & Sons. There had never been sons, only hope, and stepped inside the hush of gears and oil. Lamps were trimmed low to spare his eyes. The walls were crowded with pendulums, carriage clocks, marine chronometers, and the solemn grandfather that had once belonged to a lighthouse 3 coasts away. Each instrument kept its own cadence, but together they made a breathing, mechanical choir. Elias preferred their company to that of neighbors and customers. Cogs did not require small talk. His solitude was deliberate. Years earlier, when a spring thaw had swollen the river, he had hesitated to pull his younger sister out of a leaking rowboat. She slipped beneath the surface while he stood on the bank, paralyzed by fear of being dragged under himself. The memory of that pause haunted him more fiercely than grief. Since then he had trusted neither his courage nor his worth, and so the clockmaker busied himself with tasks that demanded precision rather than heart. One sodden November afternoon, as wind rattled the windows, a stranger arrived. He wore a traveling coat glossy with rain and seemed in such haste that the bell above the door barely finished ringing before he deposited a parcel on the counter. "For you," the man said, voice husky as if unused. "Or perhaps for the hour that needs mending." Before Elias could speak, the stranger had gone, leaving only a swirl of damp air and the faint scent of pine. The parcel was wrapped in oilcloth tied with dark green thread. Under the cord, Elias found a note penned in a hurried, looping hand. "Mend what is broken, and time will owe you a favor." Intrigued despite himself, he unfolded layers of cloth to reveal a pocket watch unlike any he had handled. Heavier, a trifle warm to the touch, engraved with symbols that were neither numbers nor letters, but spiraling, intersecting curves. 2 sets of hands shared the ivory dial. The larger pair sat immobile at 12, and the smaller pair, crafted of some iridescent metal, ticked sluggishly, as though trudging through syrup. Elias carried the watch to his workbench, lit the magnifying lamp, and cracked the case. Instead of a mainspring, he found a transparent chamber filled with flecks of silver sand that drifted around a jeweled arbor. No keyhole, no crown wheel, no logical source of power. Yet within the lid someone had etched a phrase so tiny it was barely legible. "Selflessness alone winds this heart." A romantic flourish surely, meant to amuse or puzzle. Still, Elias polished each gearlet, cleaned the pivots, and reseated the escapement with the same care he would have given a royal commission. When he reassembled the watch and snapped the case shut, the larger pair of hands quivered but did not move. He tried shaking, winding, though there was no stem, even warming the piece between his palms. Nothing. Eventually he resigned himself to uncertainty, tucked the watch in his waistcoat pocket, and returned to the ordinary symphony of clocks. That evening, crossing the market square on his way home, Elias witnessed a commotion. A boy in patched trousers sprinted past, clutching 3 bruised apples. Old Mrs. Page, the greengrocer, tottered after him, swinging a broom. Reflex, or perhaps lingering guilt, prodded Elias forward. He intercepted the boy, who froze like a startled rabbit. Instead of seizing the fruit, Elias drew 2 coins from his purse and pressed them into the lad's shaking hand. "Give one to Mrs. Page when she calms down," he whispered, "and keep the change." The act surprised him as much as it did the child. In the same instant a hush swept the square. The fountain's arc congealed mid-air. Pigeons stalled on motionless wings. Mrs. Page hung suspended half a step off the cobblestones. Bristles of her broom splayed like a painted fan. The only sound was Elias's own breath, ragged and impossible loud. He felt a faint pulse in his pocket. Drawing out the mysterious watch, he found the once frozen larger hands sweeping freely around the dial, while the smaller pair pointed to 12 and glowed faintly, as though the watch had inhaled moonlight. Time, it seemed, had paused for everything except him, and the instrument now beating against his palm. Heart hammering, he moved through the tableau. His boots made no sound. Raindrops hovered like beads of glass that he could nudge aside without bursting. After what might have been a minute or an hour, his own sense of duration had vanished. The watch emitted a soft chime. The glow faded. The fountain splashed. Pigeons flapped onward. Mrs. Page landed with an aggravated grunt, none the wiser. Elias staggered home, adrenaline singing in his veins. He spent the night dismantling and reassembling the watch, but could not divine how it had arrested the universe. One clue alone seemed firm. The phenomenon had occurred at the exact moment he handed the coins to the hungry boy. Selflessness alone winds this heart. So began a cautious, reluctant courtship between Elias Rook and the impossible. Over the following weeks, he performed what small kindnesses he could think of. He repaired a widow's kitchen timer free of charge, helped the lamplighter right his cart after a wheel snapped, rescued a tabby caught on a rooftop. Each genuine act, he learned the watch could sense the difference between duty and calculation, triggered the same suspension of reality, and each time the larger hands whirred faster afterward, as though accumulating reserve power. At first, Elias used those pauses merely to marvel. He explored raindrops, studying how light fractured inside them. He plucked snowflakes from the air and watched them melt on his glove. Gradually, however, he began to nudge events toward better outcomes. When a carriage horse bolted, tossing its driver, Elias waited until its path brought it past his doorstep. Then, pocket watch humming against his ribs, he stepped forward with a bucket of oats and a gentle voice, calming the beast while the world hung still. When the clock resumed, the horse stood placidly, and no one could explain the abrupt change. Each intervention stitched shut a seam in his long tattered self-respect. The watch did not erase the riverbank memory, but it offered him new, braver pauses, moments when hesitation became purpose rather than paralysis. Word of his helpfulness spread, though the villagers never suspected magic. They called him eccentric, yes, but also dependable, and they started bringing not just clocks, but gossip to his shop. From these conversations, Elias learned of Silas Vane, a developer from the capital who aimed to purchase half of Windlebridge, level the row of ivy-clad cottages by the river, and erect a factory. Vane's agents had been buying properties quietly. Those who refused were met with veiled threats. The scheme would ruin the estuary, poison fish, and displace families who had been there generations. Elias felt the old cowardice stir within him, an urge to huddle amid gears and let the world turn as it pleased. Yet the watch in his pocket weighed heavier by the day, as though reminding him that abstaining was also a choice. He visited the county records office one rain-slick dawn, arriving just as the clerk unlocked the doors. Inside, folders were strewn across tables where Vane's lawyers had worked late. Elias searched until he found a ledger listing bribes paid for environmental exemptions. The evidence could halt the factory if delivered to the magistrate, but the lawyers could return any moment. The ink was barely dry. What selflessness, he wondered, might justify stealing time to expose wrongdoing? Was justice for a whole village sufficient? The watch remained inert as he hesitated, a chilling echo of the riverbank. If he fled, the documents might vanish. He drew a breath, remembered his sister's water-dark eyes, and pictured the children who would breathe factory smoke. Choice crystallized. Elias tucked the ledger into his coat. Then he strode toward the entrance where a secretary was opening her umbrella. Before she noticed him, he removed his pocket watch, pressed it to his chest, and whispered, For them, not for me. The instant generosity outweighed fear, the world hushed. Papers halted in mid-flutter. The secretary froze mid-blink. Elias hurried into the streets, unmoving around him, crossed town in heartbeats and deposited the ledger through the mail slot of Magistrate Whitcomb, known for incorruptible habits even at dawn. When time restarted, Elias was blocks away, bent over tying a bootlace as though nothing unusual had happened. 2 days later, Whitcomb ordered a public inquiry. Vane, learning his private accounts had been leaked, stormed through town like a wounded bull, vowing to uncover the thief. Suspicion gravitated toward the quiet clockmaker, whose fortunes seemed to rise with every misfortune to Vane. One evening, as lamps flared against a fierce wind, Vane pounded on the door of Rook & Sons, flanked by 2 rough men. "You meddle where you're not wanted," he snarled. "Keep to your toys, Rook, or I'll smash every gear to filings, and see you driven out beside them." Elias's chest quivered, and for a moment he searched for a pretext of selflessness by which to freeze the threat. But fear for personal safety is a selfish root, and the watch lay cold in his pocket. So he simply said, "Good night, Mr. Vane," and closed the door. His hands shook so hard he dropped the bolt twice before it slid home. That night, rain hammered the roof, and the river moaned like a thing remembering old griefs. Upstream, Vane's crew, impatient after the inquiry halted construction, had dynamited a hillside to lay foundations in defiance of the order. They miscalculated the storm's fury. At midnight, runoff churned through the half-built sluices, burst the retaining wall, and poured downhill toward Windlebridge. Elias woke when the lighthouse grandfather clock stopped, a thing that had not happened once since he restored it. Silence, then a distant roar like a locomotive. He opened the door to a night lit by flickering lanterns and screams. Water foamed down cobbled streets, carrying branches, barrels, and terrified cattle. The lower quarter, where cottages huddled near the river, was already waist-deep. He could save himself by climbing to the attic and riding out the flood, but his mind filled with the faces of neighbors whose tickers he had serviced, the children who pressed noses against his windows to watch gears shining under lamplight. He buttoned his coat, snatched a coil of rope, and placed the mysterious watch around his neck. Outside, a current tugged at his boots. He pushed toward the southern bridge, convinced some sleepers had not yet been roused. Halfway there, a carriage overturned, pinning a young woman beneath its wheel. Elias wrapped the rope around a lamppost, braced himself, and heaved. The weight would pull him under if he slipped. Heart stammering, he spoke without thinking. "Please, hold on." In that syllable lived no thought for his own bones, only for hers. The roar faded, not the water, but time itself. Rain froze in crystal strands. Foam became marble. Elias felt the watch tremble against his sternum as both pairs of hands revolved like windmill blades, faster than he'd ever seen. He dragged the woman free, carried her to the stoop of the apothecary, splinted her bleeding leg with a shutter plank. He left a chalk arrow for rescuers. He waded on. At the bridge, he found a cluster of cottages almost submerged. Inside one, an elderly couple huddled on a table, water licking their ankles. Elias smashed a shutter, guided them onto a makeshift raft of doors and barrel staves. He towed them against the arrested current, muscles screaming. Each exertion dimmed the watch's glow, as if he siphoned its life with every favor. When he lifted a final child, a boy no older than his sister had been, onto a hayloft, the crystal over the dial cracked, a hairline spidering across its face. The instrument chimed thrice, weak as a dying bird. Elias wondered whether, when time flowed again, the dam of moments would surge back with a vengeance, sweeping him and the broken watch into oblivion. But there were still people to reach. He slogged into the square, seeking others stranded. At the fountain base, he found Silas Vane, thrown from his horse and clinging to the mermaid statue. His lips were blue. Surprise and terror froze his eyes wide. Elias hesitated. The watch was splintered, its power waning. He could leave Vane and no one would question. Yet what was the worth of selflessness that measured recipients? He looped the rope around his waist again, waded out, and hauled the heavy man onto higher ground. As he laid Vane down, the watch gave a final shudder. Both sets of hands aligned at 12. The glow winked out. Silence deepened. Not the enchanted stillness, but a hush that felt terminal. Elias pressed the watch to his ear. Nothing. He tucked it into his coat and waited, kneeling on wet cobbles beside the man who had threatened him. A roar returned, not mute but full-throated, as if the universe exhaled. Rain slammed down, water rushed, lantern glass shattered. Time had resumed. Around Elias came cries of astonishment as villagers discovered themselves in improbable safety. On staircases, roofs, wagons that had drifted but not capsized. They saw a narrow path of overturned barrels, doors, and ropes that seemed purpose-built for escape. Many noticed the introverted clockmaker trudging through waist-high water, steadying the magistrate or lifting Mrs. Page onto a cart. None understood how he managed so much in such chaos, but gratitude needed no blueprint. By dawn, the flood began to recede. Volunteers worked side by side, ferrying bread, blankets, and boiled water. They kept pulling Elias into the center, asking advice, squeezing his shoulder, pressing mugs of tea into his hands. For once he did not shrink from their attention. Weariness clung to him, yes, and sorrow for the destruction, but also a quiet certainty. He had not hesitated. Silas Vane, wrapped in a borrowed coat, approached on a bandaged ankle. "I owe you my life," he said, voice hoarse, "and an apology." Elias glanced toward the rubble where his own shop had stood, waterlogged windows smashed. Clocks lay silent beneath the silt. "Perhaps," he replied carefully, "we both owe the town something." Vane nodded, and true to his word, later donated funds to rebuild without factory pipes or blast furnaces. Weeks passed, winter's first frost-glazed fields silver. Under a temporary awning, Elias set up a work table salvaged from his ruined shop. Children gathered to watch him clean and oil clocks retrieved from debris. He explained escapements, let them peer through loops, and laughed. An unfamiliar sound that surprised him each time it escaped. One evening, Lily, the baker's daughter, returned to him the cracked pocket watch. They had found it while sweeping mud from the square. "It's beautiful, even broken," she said carefully. "Will you fix it?" Elias rotated the battered case. The fracture across the crystal reflected firelight like a starburst. He opened the lid. The sand chamber was empty, gears fused. Some marvels, he realized, were meant to be finite, their endings part of their instruction. "No," he answered, but smiled. "I think it has served its purpose." He placed the watch on a shelf above his bench. Around it, pendulums began anew, each cleaned and coaxed to life. Their ticking was no longer a wall between Elias and the world, but a bridge, a rhythm inviting footsteps to fall in time together. One afternoon a post came from the capital, the stranger's parcel paper, returned like a folded bird. Inside, a single sentence: "Debt settled. Use the hours wisely." Elias folded the note into his pocket. Outside, someone called that the school's bell tower was running slow. He invited 2 keen apprentices to fetch their coats. As they walked up the hill, wind rattled bare branches overhead, reminding him of gears clicking into place. For the first time since childhood, the sound of passing seconds felt not like judgment, but promise.